Welcome, folks. My name is Fraser Hughes. I'm the CEO of the Global Listed Infrastructure Organisation. First thing I'd like to do is thank the National Grid. Thanks for your facilities. Thanks to all of the IR team who helped with the logistics in the organisation. Big thanks to you guys, and I've got some lovely Belgian chocolates, which we're going to give to you a little bit later on, so please do share them out. And also thanks for your membership as well, your membership and support. Big thanks to the audience as well. 1, thanks for signing up, for registering. 2, thanks for confirming. And 3, thanks for actually showing up as well. I know sometimes that's the hard part. Okay, what's this about today? It's all about infrastructure and the role of listed infrastructure in an infrastructure allocation. Okay, Dan, next slide for me, please. Okay, a little bit of a background about the Global Listed Infrastructure Organisation. We were established in 2016 by a group of 10 US investors who were focused on global listed infrastructure investment. Today, we're now 70 members. And if you look at the corporate side of the membership, that's over $1 trillion worth of market cap. So really nice representation from utilities, communications infrastructure, energy transportation, etc. And the other 50% of the membership is from the investment management community, again, dedicated listed infrastructure managers. And between them, the managers, they manage on behalf of their clients over $100 billion worth of assets. Okay, next slide, Dan, please. Okay, and last point, my side, really what's our target as an organisation? We do lots of stuff, we put out lots of education, we do lots of research, but what's our end goal here? This graph shows you the asset class AUM growth since 2010, so 12 years. What we've seen is consistent growth in AUM over that 12-year period. So we've gone from 17 billion AUM to what we estimate at the end of last year, 150 billion. So even last year, we estimate that we added AUM despite the fact that the market dropped. So I think it's a testament to the investment story that we're going to talk about today. And it's a testament perhaps to a little bit of work that we're doing as well. What's our end goal? We set a target that this 150 billion should be 300 billion by the end of 2030. So that's an ambitious plan. And we need the whole GLIO membership, I think, to grow, but we need the GLIO membership to pull together to make that happen. Now, if that money comes in to the industry, it's going to be deployed, it's going to go into the shareholder registers of companies that are involved in the energy transition, of companies that offer stable income, stable cash flows, have inflation linkage, that are transparent, and that are liquid. And that's where the National Grid come in, because these guys, they offer it all. Nick.
Thank you very much. Look, thanks, Fraser. And welcome, everyone, to our National Grid Strand offices. It's great to have so many of you here. So I'm Nick Ashworth. I head up investor relations here at Grid, and I won't take up too much time because it's not me you're here to listen to. I'll just say that this is the first time we've used this space for an event like this, and I was super happy to be able to host it, expecting to have about 20 people here. And as more and more signed up, I was getting a bit concerned that we're going to be all the way down the corridor. So we've just about fit in. So look, thank you very much for coming along and making the effort. But look, it does go to show the huge amount of interest that we're seeing in infrastructure at the moment. And I know John and I have seen this over the last 12 months. It's been great to get out and about and see people again. And we've travelled far and wide. It's been a little bit tiring, but super exciting. And we've met so many people. And I think 2023 is going to be exactly the same, to be honest. So look, with that said, it's my pleasure just to introduce the first panel. It's my CEO, John Pettigrew, and he's going to be having a chat with Jim Wright from Premier Mition. We are at the heart of the energy transition here at Grid in the UK and across the US Northeast. It's a really, really exciting time. Loads of opportunities in this decade and into the next. And I'm sure John will be talking about that in the session. So look, all I need to say is two things. One is there'll be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of each of the sessions. And so I think this one's meant to go on for half an hour or so each of the sessions. So there'll be 20 minutes of chat and a bit of time for Q&A. After the end of the second session, there'll be a short break, so you can get a drink at that point if you want. And then afterwards, there'll be time for a bit of a chat and some drinks and some nibbles. So look, that's all I have to say from me. And hope you enjoy the event. John, Jim.
Thanks, Nick. John, can we start with UK transmission? And obviously we've seen the recent announcement from Ofgem on the accelerated strategic transmission investment. There's clearly a need, maybe an unprecedented need for investment in UK transmission, taking a grid that was built in the 50s, 60s for a small number of coal plants to be able to cope with a large number of renewable intermittent generation. What are the challenges, do you think, in building that new grid? And also, how far does the Ofgem announcement, Ofgem plan go in meeting that challenge?
Well, I guess I'd start by saying it's probably worth just recognising how far the UK has come. So if you look, it wasn't that long ago, just over a decade, that more than 50% of our electricity was produced from coal. Last year, I think the stats are showing it was less than 1%. So I think there's been a 65% reduction in carbon intensity. And I think one of the days over the holiday season, I think the UK was at 82% of all the generation providing to meet the demand was coming from zero carbon sources, including nuclear. But that's a phenomenal transformation that's already gone on. But you're right, the network, very simply, was built in the 60s to take predominantly coal generation from the north and to transport it to where the demand was, which is predominantly in the south. And the energy transition and the shift to decarbonisation and wind and other renewables is really requiring a fundamental rewiring of the network. The government has set a target. It's a hugely ambitious target of 50 gigawatts by 2030. And I don't think people quite yet get the sort of sense of the scale and the pace of investment that's going to be needed. But just to give you a statistic, for National Grid, who is an important, as Nick said, we're at the heart of the energy transition, but we're just one player in terms of we're providing the transmission. We're not building the offshore wind. We will need to deliver at least 5 times more infrastructure in the next 7 or 8 years than we've delivered in the last 30. So it is a massive ramp up. And we were very pleased to see just before Christmas Ofgem make the decision on the transmission investments, which will support the 50 gigawatts. So we've got 17 projects that they've identified. It's around about £12 billion. And that's a big challenge for us. And we've already actually announced that we're establishing a new business unit to be able to deliver that capital investment. And I'm really pleased about that. And we've got a new person coming in, Carl Troell, who will be starting in a month's time, who's got great experience of delivering large infrastructure and North Sea experience, which will be critical. But in terms of the challenges, there are several. I'll start with just the regulatory framework. You will hear and you'll read in the press actually about people saying it's taking quite a long time to connect to the network. And that's true. The reality is that a lot of distributed generation and a lot of renewables have already connected to the network, and there isn't that much spare capacity. And we have a regulatory framework today that I would describe as always being one which is incentivizes you to not invest until the very last moment and only when you're absolutely sure that you need to. And we need a regulatory framework that actually shifts to one that actually is about incentivizing and encouraging us to deliver the energy transition as quickly as possible. And therefore, it requires things like anticipatory investment. So today, we're not able to invest in advance of need, even though I think most people would say that things like electrification of transport and decarbonisation of generation is going to happen. It's not, maybe it's going to happen. And yet we have to wait and wait and wait until it's certain before the regulator allows us to do that investment. So we think there's a need actually to change the regulatory framework as we move forward. Ofgem is starting to do that. And actually the framework that we've agreed in principle before Christmas is an example of that, but it needs to go much further if we're going to deliver on the targets. The other big challenge in the UK, and actually, funny enough, it's the same in the northeast of the US and the whole of the US, is around planning. So the planning process in the UK is a very elongated process. Those 17 projects that we've got are all national infrastructure projects that require a full-scale planning process and ultimately have to be signed off by the Secretary of State. If I take our transmission project that we're building in the southwest of the UK, which is connecting the Hinkley C power station, that project end to end is a 10-year project. The first 7 years of it are planning. And actually we'll build it in 3. So it gives you a sense of, if you're trying to build 50 gigawatts by 2030, then you have to change the planning process. Now the government recognises that. They're consulting on it. We're certainly feeding into that. But without some quite fundamental changes to the planning process, it's difficult to see how those targets will be met. And then I'll give 2 more. I mean, the third area I'd say is, and again, you'll see it in the press, and if you live on the East Coast, you'll certainly feel it. But a lot of this renewable generation is coming from the North Sea onto the East Coast. And therefore, communities who live on the East Coast are going to see a disproportionate impact on their lives on behalf of the UK. So, the UK has taken the decision to decarbonise. That infrastructure has to be hosted somewhere, and a lot of it will be hosted on the East Coast. But unlike other countries in Europe and other places, local communities don't necessarily see an enduring benefit. So National Grid has been advocating for community benefits so that actually, if they're hosting it, whether it's job creation or financial support in the local community, it's something that actually should form part of the cost of the infrastructure. And those communities should see the benefit because ultimately they are doing something on behalf of the UKPSC. And then the final thing I'd say is the supply chain. This is a massive ramp up. And when I talk to the CEOs of our supply chain, what they'll tell me is that they need clarity, they need certainty, they need transparency, and they need a long-term order book. If we give them that, then actually they're actually quite bullish about their ability to respond. But the old sort of, every single project goes out to an RFP, they bid on it, some they win, some they don't. That's not going to allow them to make the investments in the capacity they need. So it links back to the regulatory framework, which we need that transparency and the ability to actually create an order book for our supply chain so that they can respond.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk to the European utilities and the US utilities, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and the provisions in that, it's not simply the tax incentives, it's also the provisions around planning, around onshoring, building the supply chain. So do we need a UK a UK version of the IRA to be able to get to where you need to be, do you think?
I'm sure the UK can afford it. I think it's 369 billion, I think, for renewable energy and about $1 trillion when you sort of multiply it up. But I do think we need more coordination. Yeah. So the energy bill is going through, but actually it needs a campaign in the UK for everybody to get behind. And the Inflation Reduction Act in the US has certainly got everybody mobilised. It's like, wind in the sails, what people want to do.
Sure.
And we haven't quite got the same wind in the sails in the UK. There is support, but it tends to be at a very low level relative to what's going on in the US. So, I think government will get there. They are getting there, but, we'll talk about it later, I'm sure. 2023, I think, is a really important year for execution. And for some of these things to convert from targets into policy and action. So.
Well, that is interesting because we're also, we're not a million miles away from a general election. And I guess the suspicion of politicians is that they're very, very good at setting, 2050 targets for net zero, or in New York, 2040 decarbonisation of electricity supply. But actually the tough decisions near term that that may impact people, the NIMBY attitude is there in the UK and indeed in the US, because obviously you've got a very big business there. Is there the political will to do that, or do we worry about the short-termism going into electoral cycles?
Well, I think they're sort of getting it, but it's not easy. Planning reform, I think everybody gets that it needs to change. Yeah. There's nobody that I talk to in government or regulators that doesn't agree that the planning process is too long. But also everybody absolutely agrees that local communities should be consulted and listened to. some of the infrastructure being built will impact on communities. So it is a difficult navigation. So if you're a local MP in the East Coast who's having infrastructure built in their community, they're going to be getting quite a hard time from their local community if they're not supportive of it. So how politicians bring all that together to find a route through is not easy. So we're very sympathetic. It doesn't change the fact that the planning process is too long. Yeah. Things like community benefits is potentially a route through that. So there's a sort of hierarchy, which is we'd rather not have it in our community. But if we are going to have it, we'd rather you build it and we don't have to see it, so put it underground. And actually, we'd quite like some compensation if you're going to do it. So we have to work through that. There are restrictions in the UK about how much you put underground, how much you put overground. There's a cost difference. So the government can change their policy on that, and they can incentivise us to support communities as well.
Sure. Yeah, no, it makes sense. And just in a broader sense, as investors, we always talk about the energy trilemma and the constant need to balance cost, security of supply, and decarbonisation in an evolving energy system. And excuse me, for very obvious reasons, in the last 12 months, cost and security of supply have come right to the top. And is there a concern that this decarbonisation agenda might be somewhat derailed because it becomes less of a priority when it's keeping the lights on and keeping the costs down to avoid recession or economic problems?
I think it's been really interesting in the last 18 months because I think there's definitely been a recognition that the trend to decarbonisation is not going to be linear. The reality is it's going to ebb and flow depending on policy, macroeconomics, geopolitics, the whole thing. The trend is going in one direction, but in any individual year, it's going to ebb and flow. I think what's really interesting over the last 12 months is that the focus on the 3 points of the triangle have sort of come into equal focus.
Yeah.
And actually, I think people are realising the interaction between them. So I think people now recognise that. So how do we avoid this crisis in the future? Well, actually, by accelerating the energy transition towards renewables, it will help with climate change. It will reduce ultimately the bills for customers, and it creates increased energy independence and therefore security of supply. So I think people have, sadly, it's through things like the war in Ukraine and the crisis we've seen in the last 12 months has got people to recognise that. There's a real challenge in the short term because you can't build that infrastructure quick enough.
Sure.
And therefore, if you look across Europe, I'm sure CO2 emissions will increase this year relative to last year. But the trend actually, I think, hasn't changed. Yeah. And actually, if anything, there's probably more alignment that actually decarbonisation is the route to solving that problem. In the meantime, affordability is something we're all very conscious about. I think it worries us all, with bills where they are, both in the UK and actually in the northeast of the US for us. And actually, although we have a relatively small role in terms of our proportion of the bill, it's still something we spend a lot of time as a business thinking about what can we do to mitigate the bill impact, particularly for low-income folks.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. In terms of funding the build, thinking about the transmission side in the UK, 17 new projects and potentially more as we get to the end of the decade. How does National Grid view the potential to maybe sell minority stakes in transmission assets in perhaps even the wider transmission business? Obviously SSE have done it with huge success. What's is there a kind of strategic thinking around that? Is it an absolute no? How do you think about that?
In November when we did our interim results, we set out what we describe as our financial frame. So our expectation between now and 2026 is that actually from 21 to 26, we expect to spend 40 billion as an organisation. 29 of that is for clean energy. That gives us about 8 to 10% growth in our asset base every year, about 6 to 8% growth in earnings. We believe we can deliver that CapEx whilst maintaining our credit rating and maintaining our dividend policy. So that's the frame that we always look at. people quite often conflate the big numbers that we talk about with CapEx as if they all have to be delivered tomorrow. This is a multi-decade program. National Grid feels very comfortable at the moment that we've got the financial capacity to do what we need to do. But when I talk to investors, I talk about, I know I've got tools in the toolkit, should I need them, whether it's raising hybrid debt or whether it's doing capital reallocation. I mean, more recently we've sold our interest in Berkeley Homes and our Millennium Pipeline, so we have the ability to do that. And actually, in our National Grid Renewables business in the US, we do that in a joint venture with Washington State Investment Board.
Right.
So they invest 49%, us we're at 51%. So we do take equity into those types of businesses. Yeah. But at the moment, for our core business, we feel very well financed for the plans that we've got ahead.
Well, there's no philosophical.
No, there's no philosophical, and I'm not short of people knocking my door.
I can imagine. Just pivoting towards distribution, because of course National Grid is now a large player in electricity distribution after the Western Power acquisition. Just thinking about electric vehicles, it fascinates me what the sort of challenge of developing the distribution infrastructure to meet the growth in electric vehicles is, and how on earth you plan that, given the uncertainty of adoption between now and when we'll all have one in 2035.
Yeah, so I think it was the Committee on Climate Change in the UK sort of did a forecast of, first of all, what's the load going to be on the network? Yeah. And I think they were expecting that the load will probably double. Yeah. So the networks are going to get much bigger with that much liquid energy transferring to the networks, even through really good optimization. You're going to see bigger networks. So we plan for that, and we can see that coming. We'd like to do more anticipatory investment, which gets me back to the regulatory thing, but we can see that coming. So we're just in the process of agreeing with Ofgem our price control for the next 5 years for our distribution business in the UK. We're expecting to invest in the network sufficiently to allow 1.5 million EVs to connect by 2028, and also about 600,000 heat pumps. What we've done with the regulator is actually put a formula in place where actually that can ebb and flow depending on what actually happens. So if we suddenly see a splurge and it starts to move towards 2 million, we can invest more and our revenues change to reflect that. Similarly, if it's less, our revenues adjust. So we've got a regulatory process actually in distribution that should allow us to invest appropriately to support that in the EVs. There are some really interesting technical things for those who are interested in technical. So in the UK business, the distribution network was built. So many of your homes have a loop where actually you share the power off the mains with your neighbour. All of them have to be unlooped in order for you to have an EV.
Right. And
in our regions, we've got 800,000 of them. So we know we have to do that. So we'll get on and start doing that in preparation for EVs. It was just an efficient way of building a network in the 1960s and 70s. It doesn't work for an EV. So we've got good projections. Yeah. We've got a regulatory form that allows us to look at it. One of the more interesting challenges is what we call the distributed system operator. So how we operate the network will change, and we will be looking for customers to provide services to the network as a way of optimizing the energy that we see. Again, I'm sure at the transmission level you would have seen in the news this week that we offer a flexibility product where people can switch off their energy over the peak as an alternative to us having more generation. It's quite unique and it's getting a lot of headlines this week. It will become the norm. So the demand side will interact much more with energy. And in distribution, we're working that ultimately your EV will also, as well as taking energy off the system, will provide energy to the system. And we're making sure that we've got the technology to be able to do that. Aggregate it, because an individual home is not very big, but we will have the technology to be able to do that. So we're working through that. In the US, we've just agreed in the last 12 months with the Massachusetts regulator, nearly $1 billion of investment to modernize the grid, install about 30,000 public chargers, or at least put the infrastructure in place to allow for 30,000 chargers, as well as put smart metering into Massachusetts as well, which they don't have at the moment. So the networks are already well on the way to evolving to support these types of new challenges.
It sounds like we can be quite optimistic that the regulators are, realising the challenge, realising the opportunity, and giving a degree of flexibility to you to meet those challenges and opportunities. It sounds like quite an optimistic picture.
Yeah, I think the mindset has certainly shifted. So I think a few years ago, regulators were very focused on customer affordability today and didn't really have the long-term lens, I think, to look around what role they were going to play in the energy transition. I think that mindset has changed, and they certainly want to be seen as supporting the policy objectives, whether it's Massachusetts, New York, or here in the UK. But there's more to do. The challenge isn't static; it keeps moving, and therefore the regulators need to stay ahead of it. I mean, one of the things we've been advocating is that in the UK, the economic regulator for energy Ofgem has no duty to support net zero. So it hasn't got a legislative duty to do that, and we've been encouraging government to put that on Ofgem because it will help us to have the right conversations.
Good. Okay. I think you've heard enough from me. I want to open it up to questions from the audience for John. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand.
Hi, John. Eloise from ACOM. I totally agree with your 4 challenges. I maybe add a 5th around skills. So you can have all the money to spend, but how are we going to, as a nation, find the skills to spend that money? And how are you going to embrace digital to enable that as well?
Yeah, so as an Ashgrid last year, we did a study looking at what skills will we need and what volumes will we need. Actually, we did it for the whole energy sector, and what that study showed is about 400,000 people is what we need, and about 120,000 in this decade. So not just National Grid, but the energy sector in the UK. So there's a huge step up in skills is what's needed. I feel very lucky, if I'm honest, as a CEO, because National Grid is at the heart of the energy transition, and what we're finding when we talk to kids coming out of school who want apprenticeships or graduates coming out of college is they want to be part of something that actually has an impact on society. So the fact that we are sort of so core to the energy transition is a great sales pitch that I have in terms of a proposition as to why you should come and work for a company like National Grid. But the step up is significant, and one of the things that in particular we're focusing on is how do we encourage people from backgrounds who historically have not been attracted to this industry. So what we know is that if we just focus on half the population, i.e. male, then we're not going to be able to get enough people into the organisation and into the industry. So we're working quite hard with various organisations about encouraging girls to do STEM subjects in school that then leads into engineering or analytical type subjects, so that we've got the pipeline coming through. In terms of our own staff, we're doing a huge amount in terms of personal development. We've got a fantastic training centre. It's the only one, I think, in industry that's got an exemplary award from the school inspectorate every year for the last 5 years. So we're investing heavily to make sure that our teams have the right skills, but it really comes down to the pipeline and making sure that the pipeline's there, and then working hard across all sections of society to get the people we need. In terms of digital, we've got quite an extensive program. I mean, our transmission system is digitized, so people forget that. It's been digitized for a long time. But we are making much more use now of AI and big data sets to really look how we optimize the system. And that's part of our ongoing sort of change program as part of the energy transition. What we're finding is finding digital skills is quite hard. And actually my CIO, in sort of new ways of working, work from home, work from anywhere, is whether actually our digital team will actually be outside of our jurisdiction, because the only way we can get the right skills is to potentially look in other jurisdictions and to create a centre of excellence who then provide it into National Grid. So we're exploring those types of things on an ongoing basis to make sure we've got the right capabilities that we need.
So Julie Madison, I'm joining from Bailey Gifford. Have you guys modelled the effect of a delay in regulatory change? So if you don't get the new framework by, say, 2025, what does that do to your 2030 target for those 17 projects?
Yeah, so for the 17 projects, we have effectively agreed the regulatory framework, so we're in a good place with regards to that. I think the point I'm trying to make is actually that regulatory framework more broadly needs to continue to evolve. So those 17 projects don't deliver a decarbonised electricity network in the UK. There are another 10 gigawatts of ScotWind that need to connect to the network. There is a number of offshore wind projects in the Irish Sea that need to connect. So this continues, and therefore, if we want to stay ahead of it, we need to continue to evolve the regulatory framework. But for the 17, we've effectively agreed the principles with Ofgem. That's what we did before Christmas.
Vivek Mittal from Afida. How much does Brexit affect these four factors that you've talked about, good or bad, in the future?
So I think probably less about Brexit, but what I would say is the supply chain. Sorry, let me step back up. Every country is doing the same as the UK and the US. So we are competing for resources and capability in the supply chain with other countries. So to the extent that we can't put the right regulatory frameworks in or give transparency or get the order book right, then that supply chain will go elsewhere. So when I look across at Europe, then actually they've got more transparency on things like the order book than we have in the UK. So it's less of a Brexit, but it's more around making sure that we are, as a UK PLC, a really attractive place for the supply chain to want to invest in capabilities. As I said, when I talk to them, they're very up for this in terms of they think they can respond to it, but they need to see that visibility, which links back to regulation and policy. So it's less of a Brexit, I think, and more about making sure that we're competitive.
I know there's been concerns about European supply chain moving to the US, and I know the politicians are getting a little bit nervous about that. So do you think there's enough transparency and potential in the UK to stop nascent UK suppliers, maybe suppliers of things that we'll need a decade out, moving to the US rather than staying in the UK?
Well, again, it's about putting the right frameworks. A very simple example is cables. Yeah. So there isn't enough cable manufacturing capacity in the world to support the decarbonisation in the developed world. So you have to build that capacity. When I talk to cable manufacturers, what they'll tell you is, well, if you give me a 200-kilometre contract, John, I'll tell you where it fits into the existing capacity I've got. We know we'll probably need 10,000 kilometres, but if you give me 10,000 kilometres over the next decade, I'll build you a factory. So there's a linkage between the policy, the frameworks, and getting the supply chain in place. So we know what we need to do, and those are the conversations we're now having. And that would stop the stem of people going to other countries that could do that.
And Turner, the Italian grid operator, have a vertical integration where they own their own cable manufacturing. Is that something you would ever consider?
No.
No.
I have a strong ethos, which is focus on the capabilities that you have. I'm not sure my team can manufacture cables.
Oh, that was a good answer. Yeah.
Hi, John. Yeah, Ed Field from Fidelity. I just wanted to go back to your comment about unlooping in the distribution network, because I'm not familiar with it. So roughly, what is that, a couple of quid or 1,000 quid per house? And do you have that issue in the US in some of your distribution networks?
Less so in the US, just because of the way that domestic properties are configured. They tend to be further spread out in the US. I don't know. It's not. It's covered in our price control. It's probably a few hundred quid. But we have 800,000 of them in our region that we will need to uncouple. So effectively, if you come off the mains, it basically have a single line that then loops into the two houses. You just have to unloop it. So it's a relatively simple procedure. You could wait until someone says, I've got an EV and do it. But actually, on the assumption that by 2035 most people will have them, we think it's something we could get on with. So.
Hi, John. This is Michael Ryskowski from Atlas. We have reviewed your future of energy scenarios, and no matter what scenario you look at, essentially by 2050, there's a great incremental demand coming from electrolysis and also from exports of electricity. Now, my question is whether that's going to create a great amount of capex for your core transmission and distribution businesses, or is it more of an opportunity just for renewables and storage complexes and for interconnectors?
Yeah, so And we certainly are expecting in the long term that, load on the networks will grow, and things like electrolyzers and heat pumps and EVs, all of them drive that investment. The way we think about it is, one, first of all, optimize the network that we've got. So, most people miss the point that the networks are built and designed to meet one single half hour a year. The rest of the time there is spare capacity. So if you can shift the load to where that spare capacity is, then actually it's a much more optimum way of running the network. So things like EVs is a classic example where, if you read the Daily Mail, they'll say, well, if lots of EVs connect to the system can't cope. But the reality is you won't be charging all the EVs at 5 p.m. at night in the middle of winter. We will actually have the technology to move it. And actually, with AI, it'll know that typically you arrive home at 4:30 and you leave at 6 o'clock in the morning. And actually, is all you care about is that your car is charged when you use it. And during that period, we'll optimize it. So that offsets some of the load growth, and that's a good thing. But, back to my original point, with electrification of transport, with the electrification potentially of heat, electrolyzers, all those things will add to the load of the transmission system and to the distribution system. So they are part of our projections. When we look at our CapEx forecasts, we separate it into investment for asset health and reliability, investment for load growth, connecting new generation and new demand sources as well. So all of that will play out. But again, it's not something that suddenly switches overnight. So we can see it coming, is the other point I'd make, is our team are very good at forecasting load and managing it. And gradually over time, you can make those investments so that you can meet that load. In terms of interconnectors, we have been very successful on the interconnectors over the last few years. We're just building out our last one to Denmark. So we'll have 7.8 gigawatts of interconnection to mainland Europe. I think it's an important part of security supply, both in terms of the two-way nature of them. So if you look at this winter, there are days when they're importing into the UK to support us, and there are days when we're exporting to France and other countries to support them. Also, from a resilience perspective, when you think about a network that is predominantly being supported by intermittent generation like offshore wind, there will be periods where the wind doesn't blow. The more interconnected your network is, the more you can spread out beyond weather fronts, and therefore you can mitigate some of that risk. So interconnectors have actually got quite an important role to play in resilience as we move forward with more intermittent generation.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, if there's any up there. Right, I'll ask a quick question. I have one more question. We've not spoken about gas at all, and you obviously have a big gas infrastructure business in the northeastern US. How do you feel about gas in broad terms, given the decarbonisation agenda, given the growth of renewables? What's the future for gas in the US?
Yeah, well, last year in Ashgrid, we did quite a number of transactions, which we call a strategic pivot. Yeah. We did that actually on the back of all the work that we've done on future energy scenarios. And whichever way we looked at those scenarios, the first thing that was clear that electricity demand growth is going to be strong, long-term and certain for many decades to come. But gas has also got a really important role. Most people forget, both in the UK and in the Northeast, 4 times as much energy goes through the gas network that goes through the electricity network. So you can't practically, and from an engineering perspective, actually suddenly switch off the gas network. And then when you add on top of that electrification of transport and everything else that's going on, you get very quickly to gas has got an important role to play. And the strategic pivot that we did was to get the shape of the group to be 70% electric, 30% gas, which is what we are, which we sort of think broadly reflects the energy transition. In the Northeast, we're quite lucky in that actually our businesses are in very progressive states. Sure. And actually what we see is that, really good engagement with the governors and the regulators and the stakeholders on the future of gas. So in Massachusetts, we filed just before Christmas how we see the future of gas, and we're waiting for a response on that. And in April last year, we launched what we called the Fossil-Free Future for Gas, which is really very simply looking at what the role gas can play in a decarbonised world, which is there's great opportunities to inject hydrogen and renewable natural gas into our networks to decarbonise them. That's not to say that there will be electrification of heat. The role of gas networks will change, but those are the conversations we're having in Massachusetts and in New York at the moment to really lay out what's a pragmatic, sensible plan. But whichever way you look at it, it's difficult to see that gas isn't going to be with us for many decades to come.
Okay. John, thanks on behalf of GLIO. Thanks very much. Great answers, and thanks for your time.
Great questions. Thank you.
Cheers.